guys, so I'm here today to do my mid-month reading wrap-up for the month of February. I'm trying to get back into the habit of this since I missed one in January, but I like doing them in the middle of the month and at the end of the month because it gives me more opportunity to talk more in depth about each of the books I've read. And I'm doing this one a little bit early. You can probably guess it's not quite the middle of February, although in saying that, February is a shorter month. But I'm going to Edinburgh in a few days and won't have another chance to film this before I go, and I'm taking my camera or anything with me. So I wanted to tell you about the 5 things I've read so far in the month whilst I had a chance. So without further ado, let's jump straight in. The first book I finished in February I was carrying over from January, and that's Mules and Men by Zora Neale Hurston. This book actually first came out in the 1930s, and Zora Neale Hurston was a black female anthropologist living in the United States of America, having grown up in the United States of America. And her work, both her fiction work and this, which is sort of like a blend of non-fiction and fiction, focus on folklore. So she's like a folklorist as well as like an anthropologist. I'm not sure if I'm describing that very well, but what she does essentially in Mules and Men is that it's framed with a sort of non-fiction narrative from her perspective, where she's been studying away from her where she grew up in America, and she is about to start a project where she starts collecting different communities' folklore together and the stories they tell one another together for posterity, because a lot of them are shared orally and not written down. And she wants to kind of collect these together and study them. And she wants to start with her hometown, so she goes back to her hometown because she thinks at least in this environment she is one of them and they know her, so it will be like a sort of like good jumping off point. And that's the kind of framing of the narrative, and then within that we get all of these folk tales that are being shared with her. So it is both a collection of folk tales and a kind of non-fiction work of one woman going and collecting these folk tales. There were things I really liked about this and other things that just didn't capture my imagination. I far preferred the non-fiction side of this, the side where she was going and collecting the folklore. I didn't find the stories themselves, however, grabbed my imagination that much, so I found reading them a little bit meh. They were interesting, but they got a little bit samey. They were very steeped in sort of Christianity, so they had less of that magical side and more of the sort of religious side, which isn't necessarily something I'm as interested in, but it was certainly still an interesting book to read. There was just sort of like peaks and troughs in my interest as I was reading it, but that's not to say I wouldn't recommend it, and I would probably read more by Zora Neale Hurston in the future, because I thought this was interesting, and I think she's written more traditional novels I'd be interested in, but I wasn't like enraptured by the whole reading experience. Similarly, another 3-star read for me was Queen of Blood by Sarah Beth Durst. I'm so sad to say that I didn't love this book, because I know a lot of you said you were really excited to read it in my haul when I mentioned it. But this is a high fantasy novel set in a world where there are 6 different types of spirits. There are earth spirits, water spirits, fire spirits, air spirits, wood spirits and ice spirits, and the magic comes from these spirits, which are sort of in charge of things kind of growing and living, and basically through them life happens and the world goes on, but they're also incredibly dangerous, so they're controlled by women who have an affinity for spirits, and one woman in particular who becomes queen. And we follow our protagonist, whose village was attacked by spirits when she was younger, and she discovered she had an affinity, so she then goes on to study and train that power in the hopes of becoming queen one day. However, I loved the premise of this book. My issue was that it felt like 3 books crammed into one. It was just too fast and rushed. There was a lot of 2 years later, 4 years later, 6 months later, 3 months later. And that works sometimes, but I think if that is too frequent in a book, it gets really irritating, because I'm expected just to take for granted the development of characters and relationships that's happened in that time period rather than seeing it. So I'm being told a lot of things and not being shown a lot of things, and because of that it just went by too fast. Like, it was sort of like it was here and then it was gone again. And I didn't really feel like I had time to really connect to the characters, even though I think the premise was really interesting and the world was really interesting. So unfortunately this one was again a little bit of a middle road read for me, and I don't know if I will continue on with the rest of the series in this instance. I enjoyed my next read a little bit more though, and that was The Black God's Drums by P. Jelly Clark. This is a novella. It's one of Tor.com's novellas. They publish a whole series of these of science fiction and fantasy works that include some popular ones like Binti and the Wayward Children's series. This one is a standalone novella, I think, which I have to say is actually such a shame, because this is a story I would love to see followed in further books. I would love to see what happens to the characters. This is a book where, although it was a short book and I would have wanted more and more of the world, it didn't feel rushed because it focused in on one specific sort of event that was going on, and around that sort of built up our knowledge of the world. It's set in an alternate sort of universe in the United States, where during the American Civil War neither side won. They just decided to divide themselves up into the north and the south. So there's still slavery in the south and there's no slavery in the north, and New Orleans is a sort of in-between zone. It is part of neither the north or the south, and our protagonist, Creeper, is a 13-14-year-old girl whose parents have both died and lives in New Orleans. She also has a connection to an African god that the slaves brought over with them when they were abducted, essentially. So she is able to communicate with this god in her mind, and she sort of wants out of her life, which is very much just sort of like pickpocketing, living hand to mouth, running sort of wild in the streets, and get some information, which means she might be able to trade for a new exciting life, and we follow that. But it's a compact story. It only takes place over a few days, and it's so intriguing, such an interesting premise. Oh, and because of things like learning about the technology that was being used in the South to subdue the slaves, so this is very much a kind of steampunk historical science fiction novel, that was so disturbing and so fascinating that, again, I would just love to read more in this world, and perhaps see what happens further between the North and the South, and if war breaks out again, and what happens, and if it, you know, follows the sort of timeline of real events where slavery is ended throughout America. And I just want the author to write another book in this series. They might, but at the moment it looks like a standalone. However, I'd still recommend reading it because it's such a fascinating concept, just very enthralling, and kept me wrapped up in the world for the few pages that it lasted. Continuing with the theme of novellas, the next two I read were short. The first one I think is more of a novelette or a short story than even a novella, and that is The Terra Braid by Zen Cho. Like I said, very short, but even in a short space of time managed to completely capture my imagination. It's based in sort of Chinese beliefs around the afterlife and the underworld and death and what happens to you after you die. And our central character is a young woman who died when she was around 19 and has since been living in hell, essentially, in the underworld. And we get this kind of vivid, dark picture painted of what hell is like. And in hell, she was sold by some distant relatives as a bride to a rich man. So she is his wife, and he has since, at the beginning of the story, taken a new wife, but his new wife, or his second wife, isn't actually a dead human. It's a terracotta woman that was burned by his relatives or descendants for him in the underworld, so she was never really alive, but when she's burned and this figure is sent down into the underworld for him, she becomes alive in a sense. And it's about our central character's relationship with this new bride, and oh, it's so dark and unnerving but emotional. There is wonderful queer themes explored in it. I just like took my breath away, really like wrenched at my heart, had me feeling all the feels, and definitely convinced me that Zen Cho is a writer I would like to read more by, because her prose are gorgeous, and I just thought this was such a creative short story slash novelette that I'm definitely going to check out her novel next. But lastly, I read a 5-star novella during this month. Favourite thing I've probably read so far this month, which will come as no surprise to you once I tell you about the premise, but that is called The Tea Master and the Detective by Aliette de Bodard. Wow, okay, let me tell you, this is basically science fiction Sherlock Holmes where Sherlock Holmes is a woman, not called Sherlock Holmes, but the Sherlock Holmes equivalent character is a woman, and the Dr. Watson character is also female, but actually a mind ship, which means a living ship. So a ship that is powered by a real mind in space, and our Sherlock Holmes character hires this mind ship called the Shadow's Child to take her into deep space so that she can get a body, so that she can study it to look at the effects of deep space on decomposing bodies. And then when they pick up this body, it turns out that something untoward has happened and she's not died of natural causes, so a mystery unfolds. And it's incredible. Like, why would I not love that? An incredible mystery set in futuristic space, following two characters that are essentially Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, but women, and one of them's a ship. So weird, I know. Could go really wrong, but didn't. Was so well done, and this is another book. I wish there was more books in this series. It's actually set in a shared universe that other authors have written stories in. However, I want to follow these characters. I want like a whole Sherlock and Watson style series of short stories, but following these two characters in space. And I just desperately hope that the author does decide to write more about these characters, because I thought they were brilliant and fascinating. They were both affected by serious things that happened to them in our past, their past. The ship mind had gone through some real trauma and been abandoned at one point in deep space, which had sort of left her with a kind of PTSD. Equally awful stuff seems to have happened to our other character, the detective character, that leads her to sort of regularly drugging herself, like Sherlock Holmes. So good. I loved it. I thought it was so incredibly well built a world in such few pages. Again, this one was like 90 pages, but brilliant, and I loved it, and I thought the mystery unravelled really well, and it was really interesting. Yeah, this is just one of those situations where you gush about something. I love this and I want more so much. But those are all the books I've read so far in the month of February. I would love to hear your thoughts on any of them if you have read or are interested in reading any of them. And have you read anything good in the month of February so far? Let me know. But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye guys!